just wanted to, while we're waiting, do you mind if I have a selfie with you? Could you all smile? Thank you. Have we started? Oh, it's moving. It's moving through. Oh, right, okay. How do you move it back? Okay, so we're going to start by briefly introducing ourselves and our work, and then we're going to talk a little bit about why the comics form, and finally we're going to hopefully have time for discussion about it. So these are the two books that I've published. One is a graphic novel, which is simply a long-form comic. The other one on the right, The Inking Woman, is a history of British feminist cartoons and comics, so but for a general reader. I began illustrating. I wasn't trained as an artist. I began illustrating in the 90s following the death of my 2-year-old child. I had a healthy baby that was born, and as he got older, he had symptoms of cold, a common cold. And the doctors said, because it's not going away, it must be something else. So we took him to the doctor for a series of tests, and that still nothing. Finally, when he was just over 2 years old, we took him to the main hospital in Britain. I'm from UK. And they looked at him. It was for a lung investigation. And they noticed it was his heart. And he had 4 deformities of his heart, which was a lot, but they had been working to keep him alive. So the top doctors, operated on him, but he died following surgery. And afterwards, my husband and I were so distraught that my husband's an artist, and we turned to drawing to keep us going. And so this enabled me to develop my career as an illustrator, and here's some of the works I did. But many years later, after the death, I realized I was familiar with the comics form, and my illustration was quite cartoony, and I thought I wanted to develop the story as a comic, as a graphic novel. So this is the style that I carried through it. And it's a very personal subject matter, but I wanted it to be communicated to the audience, the reader, in a way that explored ideas around taboos around death, certainly in the West, where I live. And so why is funeral etiquette so unclear to us when death is as common as birthdays and marriage? So in the UK, you get an invite to a marriage, or you get an invite to the birth of a child to celebrate. But when someone dies, there's no invitation system, so you don't know whether you can go or not. When the way I did it, produced it, was I produced a series of small booklets with my second child, my daughter, who was 12. And we had little cartoon strips. This is our dog then, fun things. And then when the book was published, in the series of short zines, I included chapters of my graphic novel. And then I sent them each time to publishers and people who were reviewing, and friends. And so and then a publisher saw what I was doing and said, we'd like to make it into a book. And when the book came out, this is when I was famous for 15 minutes on national TV in Britain. And so I've captured it. They made a special film. They made a special film about it because we associate comics with the funny and with fun entertainment, with cheap throwaway publications. So to produce something about death and bereavement was very serious subject matter. While I was, this was maybe nearly 10 years ago, and there were talks in London at the time about the graphic novel. And I noticed that all the people speaking about it were men. So I I just said, where are the women in this conference? And I felt people wanting me to be quiet, except one other woman who's down in the bottom. And we became friends in the coffee breaks and met and decided to set up a small group, which is women-led, but not women only, where people can discuss the types of works that we were interested in. So not so much comics as superheroes, but comics more as the autobiographical and more serious subject matters that were being dealt with. We just launched this year the first prize for women-only prize in UK only for graphic novels in progress. I'm now handing over to Kanchan. Here we go.
Namaste. My name is Kanchan. I'm an artist and a writer, so I'm gonna start from like 2005. So between 2005 and 2009, I was studying abroad in the US, and I was an economics student at that time. And but I really like to draw. मलाई एकदम ड्राइङ गर्न मन लाग्ने, तर घरमा चाहिँ आर्ट पढ्छु भनेर भन्न नसक्ने, इकोनोमिक्सै पढ्नुपर्ने. So त्यसै गरेर for 2 years I studied economics, and then it was too frustrating, and then I said, okay, I'll just study art and art history, and I won't tell anyone until like I finish. And so in my last year of college, I actually told my family, okay, I'm actually studying art and not economics. And so when I got back, in 2009 I finished my bachelor's in studio art and art history, and I came back to Kathmandu, and then I started working as a reporter in Republica newspaper. Before that, in 2005, I had also worked for Kathmandu Post as also a reporter, and at that time I also did some illustrations for like the fiction section called the Fiction Park. So this illustration चाहिँ मैले weekly basis मा गर्थे. अनि so when I came back, I did this drawing saying, hi, I am a Jhole Patrakar, you know, because I always had this bag like Patrakars. And then I met so many people while I was reporting, and I had so many stories that I could not write about in the newspaper. And I was reporting a lot about art and artists. So what happened was I started a blog. It was a new like digital platform that was very exciting, and there I started collecting like photographs and drawings, and also just writing about my experiences in Kathmandu. कहिलेकाहीँ अब माइक्रोबसको कचाकचको बारेमा देखि लिएर बाटोमा के भइरहेछ रत्न पार्कमा. So these were things I started writing about in the blog, and it was called it still exists, With Love from Kathmandu. And now I don't write as much, but I will try to write more. And so there I started making comics about my everyday, like going to the dentist, you know, or, you know, meeting people, and I started drawing characters. Okay, so this is another drawing about a comic book that I made about my leg. म चाहिँ लडेर मेरो त्यो ligament tear भएको थियो. अनि it was very painful, and I did a comic about my ligament that, you know, was like giving me nightmares. So यस्तै मैले चाहिँ ब्लगमा गर्न थाले comic book. I think I should stand. And so मेरो आर्टमा चाहिँ usually then I began to explore more of text because I was also writing. So I started making artworks that were a combination of drawing and that included text. And this one also includes like needle and thread, and it's about so the newspaper came out with a environment issue, and this was about trees and a pomegranate tree in my neighborhood that was cut down to build a house. So this artwork kind of was on the front page of the newspaper, and then I kind of realized that also my attachment with text was just not about writing, but also that I wanted to make it part of my artistic practice. Sorry, something is like... and then in 2013, I got an opportunity to submit a short graphic story for Lalit magazine, and for the first issue. And I also did the cover illustration for the issue, and I was able to publish this short graphic story, which for the first time in public, I wrote about my relationship with my father, and explored like I was raised by a single mother, so it kind of explores like being abandoned by my father at a very young age. And so between 2013 and 15, I went to Sweden to study for my master's in fine arts. So I took a break from writing, and then I decided to pursue further in fine art. And that's where I kind of moved away from the graphic story, but then I did a lot of work around text. And so this was like a huge ground, abandoned school ground, where I dug everything with hand, and I wrote this text. And it says, "Maybe I have come with hands empty and you two have nothing to offer." So it was more of an offering, empty, but still an offering to the viewer, and to think about it and what it means, to come to a new place, and that exchange, what happens there. So it was exploring that. So for my final master's thesis, I again worked with text and poetry. And this time the subject was a very personal one for me, like being raised by a single mother. And at that time, there was a lot of talk about the new constitution and the citizenships, after the mother's name, and having experienced that difficulty in getting my citizenship because my mother was a single divorced woman. I wrote a long poem and a spoken word text about that experience. And so this was a performance along with text. And so this is like a detail. I hand cut all the parts of the poetry, and I handmade on Nepali paper. And and I performed these during the exhibition. And this is the last work that I want to show, is another text-based piece that I made. So this is like a laser-cut wooden. It's a table, and the text has been cut on plywood with the laser cutter. So, and these are some of the short poems that I have been writing on my blog. And so I'm gonna hand over this to Nicola, and we're gonna talk about why choose comic book, as a form.
Yeah. Why the comic? Well, actually, let's start with why the visual, because both of us are interested in the visual. When I began this, I wanted to take a selfie, because when I get home to my family, I won't be handing them the program of this festival. I'll be saying, look, here are my new friends. So I think the visual will tell them more of a story than the text. So I think we respond to visual, and certainly I'm not sure. Do people recognize the Beano, or is it something? Show of hands, who recognizes the Beano? Okay, not so many. So that in the UK and in the West, it's and America, very famous type of comic for children, really. So that's what we associate with in the West. And excuse my very Western-centric position, and we'll be discussing that. Can I just ask, can you raise your hands if you recognize any of these characters? Okay. I wonder if, can you raise your hands if you recognize the first three? Okay. So did some of you read Indian comics when you were children? Yes? Raise your hands. Okay. So perhaps for myself, for us in the West, the first three are very, very iconic cartoon characters. even if, so this is Tintin and Snowy, this is Charlie Brown and Snoopy, and this is a character called Miffy by a Dutch illustrator. So even if I didn't read the cartoons and comics, didn't know the stories, I knew the characters as people, just from the visual, and very simple visual. So we have certain expectations around the form and the content. The other picture I didn't put is superhero, and perhaps you know Spider-Man, Captain America, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman. So what's happened again in the Western context, this was a book that came out in 1980 in a sequence of small serial volumes by an American artist called Art Spiegelman, and this was called Mouse, and it was the story, his parents' autobiographical story of their experience in Nazi Germany during the Holocaust. So we have many, in the UK we have many films, and America, about the Holocaust, the German Nazi Holocaust, but this was a new way of telling the story, and it was much more personal. Also, it told the story using mice as the Jews and cats as the Nazis. And at first, the publishers wouldn't publish his collection because they said, you're laughing at a very serious subject matter. Millions and millions of people were killed. You know, you're laughing at the idea of genocide. But when the publisher did accept it, it sold millions of copies, and it's become very well known, and it won a very big prize, Pulitzer Prize, which usually goes to prose. This was another example of an Iranian-born woman artist who is now based in France, and it's about her experience of growing up during the 70s, the revolution, and moving for safety. Her parents moved her to Europe, and so you see this image here of her. Half of her is her experience as a devout Muslim girl, and the other half is growing up as a Western teenager. Very simple form. The comic that really inspired me is by a Canadian artist, and I never came across it through comics, but through a friend of mine, a woman friend, who was experienced domestic violence in her marriage. And in England we have centres to help women, to offer assistance and refuge. And this book she had found there and lent it to me. And it's the story in very simple comics form of a woman's experience of her relationship turning into one of violence, of mental abuse that slightly becomes physical at the end, and how she leaves him in the end. So although it's not my experience, it enabled me in just quickly 1 hour to read it, to see the experience. And before that, I'd never really digested it, and it had such a powerful effect on me. I felt like I'd been kicked. So, and you know, that's the power of the visual and the power of the comics. Oh, I was going back, and so I know who'll look after the kids. I don't give it. This is the husband. I don't give a shit. Ask your mother. She should be good for something. So that was my introduction. Actually, I was just going to back when we were chatting earlier. Kanchan, you were talking about how you discovered, how you were first introduced to this comic Mouse.
Yeah,
do you want
it was like when we studied like social studies in our schools, where World War II is very like short paragraph. They don't give any details about what happened, and it's mostly glorified. Yeah, Gold Cross soldiers, and so I actually came across this book when I was a college student abroad, and I was really surprised that this was not part of our social studies book, and it was a very general overview of the World War II, and so this book kind of put a lot of things into perspective for me, and also although it was a very complex issue, it was very easy to read and understand, and actually I can't say that I can understand what the characters went through or what the people actually went through the Holocaust, but then it gave us gave me some kind of way to relate in a human way, you know.
And also to learn a
history.
And it's the same. It was the same for me for Persepolis, because we may see the stories of revolution or war on the news, but if it's not within our own experience, sometimes it's hard to digest. So that's certainly.
Yeah, and same thing with the Iranian Revolution. It's like we only heard names pop up here and there on TV or in the media, but this.
Oh, sit down. We have to sit down. Sorry. Yeah.
So this, like, actually, you know, she writes it from when she is a small child to growing up, getting married, and you know, there's like two parallel stories of the revolution as well as a personal life. So how do you, you know, how do you deal with a life like that, you know? Because a lot of us also grew up, you know, with the Maoist revolution in the background, and we experienced many things parallel, you know, and I think that's one way to also communicate a story, a complex story.
And I think the success of it is that it's the everyday of, even in this war-torn situations, people are still having to get up and go to bed and find rest and shelter and comfort. I think it's those, and food. So it's the everyday experience that there's some aspects that everyone can relate to, even though it's not in a war. But what was interesting about Dragon Slippers, by this Canadian artist, was she sold millions of copies, and it was translated into many different languages. But my experience, no one in my experience of the comics world ever refers to it. So it was about taking the form outside comics, outside art, and into a women's refuge, or into you know, as an education and sharing of experience. So this is the other thing I wanted to tell you actually about Rosalind B. Penfold. This was her pen name because she was protecting her identity. But over the years I emailed her and actually became friends. She was in Canada. She's now a good friend. The interesting thing about this, she was age 59 when she produced this graphic novel, and it was her first. She wasn't trained as an artist. And I mentioned that in the UK we're hosting a prize, a cash prize for women's graphic novels in progress, and the author, Rosalind Penfold, is supporting one of our prizes. So it's really nice. It's a prize specially for women over 50. But it's not just older women, it's younger women. And here's some examples. This is a young woman British woman who calls herself on Twitter Ruby, etc. Every day she draws pictures about her own experience of living with mental health issues, and she has the most enormous following online. So she may be at times unable to leave her bedroom or her room because of anxiety and her mental health, but she has this huge support system via an online platform that not all the population has access to the internet, but for those who do, it's a very exciting new platform, particularly for women. And from that, the publisher approached her, and she then published a collection of her cartoons with some text around mental health. But closer to home, this is an Indian artist and who is actually a feminist activist, and she also uses the internet as her platform. And I've only recently been introduced to her webcomic, which is called Sanitary Panels, and she launched it on Facebook, and again has thousands and thousands of followers. And I don't know if you can read it. "Follow your dreams, says society." And then the woman says, "I want to do something that lets me express my creativity," and society goes, "Ha ha ha ha, lol. Here's the list, kiddo. Doctor, engineer, business, CEO." And I think it's quite nice that, because it relates to your own story of you didn't dare tell your mother you were you'd gone to study economics on the list. This is the list. Do you relate to that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of young people do.
Yeah.
Um,
And again, this is
Miss
a hero from Nepal. Do you want to talk
Yeah.
about
So I don't know if
Heroine?
many of you are familiar, but this is by the artist Kripa Joshi, and she created this character called Miss Moti. It can be pronounced Mot. So the backstory is that Kripa Joshi, as an artist, she struggled with weight issues, and a friend of hers, and this I'm telling you from reading her website, nicknamed her Moti, which in Nepali, it's very like, uh, it's very offensive, but still we do it. Like, Moti, Dubli, Kale, Gore, Khaire, that's how it goes, and we're not so sensitive about it. But it can be traumatic experience for the person you are labeling. And so she takes the word Moti, and she actually uses it as moti, which is a pearl. So she takes the word and changes it into something powerful and that she can use. And so in this, she created the character Miss Moti. And so she, Miss Moti has several adventures, and she has different books, and she's appeared in different comic book anthologies. And I'm just going to quote what she writes about Miss Moti from her website. So the quote is, Miss Moti represents a woman who was plump and also displayed a sense of purity and innocence. So this is an example of, reclaiming a word, that is often considered derogatory, and using it to, share a story. And this is something relatable to many people, not just women, and I think, and not just related to like body image issues, but it could be for other disabilities, for other stereotypes that we put on people, and that the judgments that we make.
I just wanted to add, so Kripa studied in the US, and at a high level, she then moved to Britain, and she's now based in Britain and is my friend. And not only that, she was a judge of the Ladies Do Comics Prize. So, and actually she spoke here at this festival last year, I think. So, and I just want to tell you, her recent wonderful works are a series called Motivations, as in motivation, and they're these motivational sayings, and she does these drawings of Miss Moti, which are going to be collected, hopefully, and published as a collection.
The next artist we wanted to show from a Nepali context is Preena Shrestha, and Preena is we're familiar with many like Nepali artists who have their works published on newspapers like Everyday, the caricature, satires, political commentaries, and Preena is, at least I know, is the only woman or female artist whose works has been published like comics on a regular basis in mainstream Nepali media. So for many years her work was published weekly in the Republica newspaper and also in Nepali Times. And so this is an example of how an artist explores the everyday through the graphic form. And so here, says, who needs dystopia fiction when you've got all this? And all this means like the bad news daily. And so her work is really, I feel like, an inspiration for young Nepali female artists, and they're funny, they're relatable, and also I think there is a social commentary going on also, but not that blatant like political satire and like caricature of politicians. So that's always not necessary to convey do a political or social critique, and something like this also works and is equally effective. And so a lot of her works are very like autobiographical, so they're based on her everyday, and I think that's an inspiration for a lot of young female artists who also participated in the workshop that happened this week, which Nicola will talk about more. And also they're very self-reflective, So it's not just like pointing this and that, but really like talking from her experience and actually making fun of herself.
And I just wanted to add, because earlier we were talking about should we include the newspaper cartoons, and then you were saying, but well, I can't think of any news or something like that, and then I was saying, well, it's the same in Britain. The political cartoons in the newspaper is a masculine endeavor, just as and yet at the same time there are women making cartoons and making a good living from cartooning, and my research historically in the UK shows this. There are women, but I think I have a couple of friends who have cartoons in the national papers in the UK, and constantly the editor says, can you make it more political? Can you make it about party politics? And they say, well, I can't. And I'm thinking, but this sort of comment is so much more political because it's wider, but it's how it's considered. And the simplicity of line as well, I was going to mention. Is that all
Next slide also has just another work by Preena. I think the text is quite small. I don't know if you can read it. But this is again like a short comic about marriage and post-marriage life with her husband. So maybe we can just like go ahead on.
Yeah, I just wanted to add back to my own historical research, collecting cartoons and comics by women in the UK. So I started looking in the newspapers, but found that wasn't the place. And it was actually women producing cartoons themselves for themselves. So as postcards or as little zines or as posters. And that's sometimes, and I think about that with something like sanitary panels. You will never see those cartoons, or you might, hopefully. That's not the I can't imagine a newspaper editor commissioning those cartoons, can you? And yet she has a huge following, and she can spread and share the message much wider. This was to tell you about more of the book, the graphic novel. This was This Side, That Side, which was a collection of, I think it's 30 collaborators, illustrators, writers, and collected Pakistani writers and Indian artists, or the other way round, and matched them together to create these stories around partition, but produced by a younger generation. So again, it was a slightly different voice that came out and a different emphasis. And another interest, so bubbling up from India is a lot of graphic novel and comics activity. Drawing the Line was a collection of an anthology produced by 14 Indian women who came together for 1 week. And it was in response to the Delhi gang rape. And so it was making a commentary about positions of women. And this was edited by Priya Kurian and Lansa, the names. So on to the British Council Creating Heroines project. And we have a stall here. Please come and visit us. And you will be able to look through and collect a copy of the Creating Heroines zine that was produced earlier this year. So what is Creating Heroines? Creating Heroines was a bringing together and a celebration of women's experience across countries, across the globe, or with South Asian artists. And in February this year, I got together with women artists from Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan to create artwork that went into this book. And part of that process was discussions about what do we mean by heroine, and what do we mean by the experience of being female, being a woman, and how can we share our similarities and our differences? There's a workshop coming. Oh, yeah, thank you. And so this was, it was great. It had a very good response. And what has come of it is the last 3 days here in Pokhara, the British Council has continued the Creating Heroines project. And I just facilitated a more hands-on practical workshop that was open to everyone, men and women, to develop cartooning skills. And so we've had a wonderful 3 days. Some of the participants are here in the audience, and some people joined who had never drawn before, and others joined who were actually at art school and very proficient. And again, please come and visit us at the stall and see what was produced. We went through a series of exercises and produced a one-page comic to display specifically here. And the British Council and Creating Heroines team is very keen to continue this activity. So please, if you're at all interested in graphic novel comics, or you like to draw, please come visit the stall and give us your name and a contact detail, because our intention is to run further workshops in February, and that could take any form again.
And I think that once you look at the drawings there, I think
what? Is it a fire?
No, not fire.
Okay. What? Do we stop? At ease, everyone. 2 minutes. Tea break. We don't need the mics. Ooh. I think we're doing okay for time.
yeah, we have like
Have we got many more slides?
no, we need to slow down a little bit. No, we have enough. I think we'll be
We
okay.
mustn't slow down because we have to ask questions. Looking good? Oh, are we on? No. Not yet. 2 minutes, they'll tell us. Can we carry on talking? Oh, I can carry on talking. Oh, all right. Right, we can talk. So one of the things also was about creating Heroines was also about the where we take it next. So what is useful? What are the useful questions to ask? Who are these questions for? Is it just for ourselves, or can it be shared? Is it something we should be talking with for our daughters? Do you agree? Do you think? I'm just wondering, the Creating Heroines, it's, you know, if you come and join in, then it's about making the dialogue wider, right?
And I think I just wanted to say that you know, I feel like there's this question for a lot of us, like, oh, you know, how can I make a graphic novel or a comic book when I can't draw, you know? And I think that's one, like, you know, the lack of confidence comes from the lack of drawing skill. But I think that's like drawing is one small part of a you know, a comic book, and there are different styles of drawing, and the main thing is the story, is the narrative, you know, and how you develop the characters. And so even if you have like zero drawing skill and just can draw stick figures, you can still have a great story. And I think that's one you know,
yes, and sometimes I was saying to you can find a beautifully illustrated book with a story that sends you to sleep on page 2. But you can have a kind of more roughly drawn, perhaps less skilled drawing. If the story is good and if it communicates the message, it's worth gold, really, in terms of how it can be applied.
so I think our screen is
Oh,
working
we're back.
again.
Okay, let's move on. So I'm going to go through a few pages from my book, Billy, Me and You, to just reinforce tricks, or not tricks, but how I use the comics form. So to convey, I use a very, very simple style. My story was about a rather rough and a rather horrible experience. So I didn't really want the drawing to be beautiful. I wanted it to have that rough quality and simple. Oh yeah, this is the page of impact and shorthand. I know we're not allowed to stand up, but I'm gonna. Okay. The more I told people, the more intrigued I became in their responses. I found myself judging people by their reactions. My child died. Oh, my friend's baby died. In fact, I helped her through it. And then what I did, I scored them -20 out of 10, because we're all used to being scored, aren't we? Or what's the word? Not scored, but marked. Yeah. I'm so sorry. If there's anything I can do, just say 10 out of 10. Would you like to come for dinner? 9 out of 10. What happened? 10 out of 10. So it's this idea that people actually also saw themselves in the dialogue, in the book, and maybe learnt how that they in future could respond to people who were going through bereavement. But it's a very quick way of showing it. I also incorporated photography into my book, because the camera officially never lies. Of course, it's all fabricated, but it gives it a sense of reality. And I also referred to real places, so I put the name of the hospital and the date. So, and finally, this is the use of metaphor that we can use in comics form. Is it a vase? Is this still a vase? Is it still a vase? Which is normal? So again, it's using that idea to reflect on what society deems normal.
So back to me, I guess. So one of the current projects that I'm working on right now as an artist is this project called Barakato. And in short, the story follows 4 characters, and this is this story is about road development in Dolakha district. So for the last 3 years, there's been a group of researchers who are doing, and anthropologists who've been studying how development of roads have affected people's lives in rural areas in different parts of Nepal. And so they're also looking at Dolakha district, where the Upper Tamakoshi hydropower project has been like going on for the last few years, and you know, it's supposed to end every year, but it's still, they're not there yet. But because of this hydropower project, that whole area, they've had to rebuild the roads, expand it so that they can transport the materials for the hydropower project. So this book you know, is based on actually research by anthropologists, and so this is an example where, you know, academics and researchers, anthropologists are using the graphic novel form as a way to communicate their research findings, or to, you know, make it less academic and more accessible to a wider audience. And so this book is being authored by anthropologist Stacy Pig, and it's a collaborative project with multiple researchers, and you know, she's looking into a lot of archives about how the road used to be, and there's like pages and pages of interviews with local people. So, and some of these people will be the characters in the book, and it will be published in Nepali and English. And there's 3 artists who are working together and along with me. There's Sushank and Srijit Rajbhandari and me, who are actually doing all the drawing. So this, yeah.
I was just going to say, are you going to tell us a little bit about the process? Because it was fascinating talking to you earlier.
I was telling Nicola how challenging it has been. So we only started this project in May, and we've only done the first chapter, and that is still being reviewed for the book proposal. But what's been challenging is that because there's so many people involved, you know, so at first when we hadn't met the researchers, they were like, oh, they've never been to Dolakha, you know, how will they portray the people, how can they draw, you know. So they were very worried about how we would draw the characters. And we were also, of course, very worried that, okay, they don't trust us yet, but we need to prove that we can actually deliver, you know. So the process I just wanted to show briefly with visuals. So this is one of the pages where they're transporting these huge pipes. They're called penstocks, through which the water will flow from the Tamakushi River. And so this truck, it takes like 2 months to transport one penstock up to the site. And so we were trying to show that struggle, because the roads are so bad, and in monsoon everything stops. And so along the road, if you go to Tsarikot, you'll see many of these penstocks just lying on the roadside because, either the truck broke down or something happened. So this part kind of shows how penstocks are transported to the site.
Do you want me to move it on?
So I just wanted to show briefly how we work as 3 artists. Usually, like for instance, for Nicola's book, she's the author and it's her experience. It's an autobiographical book. So she's writing the script and she's drawing, which is also very difficult to do. And with 3 artists and a separate author and many other researchers who want to bring in their own narratives to the book, it's very challenging. And so what happens is that we get a script from Stacy, and the 3 artists, we sit together and then we break down the script sentence-wise, and then we discuss paneling ideas. Paneling is how to, in the comic book you have several boxes with dialogues, so these are called panels. So how to do the panel structure. And so the first person, that is me, does a very rough layout of the scene, according to the script and the description. So in this scene, it's actually we were trying to portray the old Lhasa area. So the village Lama Bagar up in Dolakha used to have relationships with villages in Tibet. So we wanted to show that how that way back linked the 2 communities. And so this is like a very rough layout. I don't put in the text. It's just like people are very rough and just for clouds, I just wrote clouds instead of making clouds. So and this version gets revised many times. And you're just looking at one of it. So it's been through several revisions. And then the second person goes and does like the penciling with actual like drawing in the details and everything. And then the third person again goes back and does all the final digitizing. And so this process is called inking, which used to be done manually and is still done, but we've kind of chosen to do it digitally for this book.
Was that, could you mention, you mentioned that your team had contact with Jessica Abel in America.
Yeah, so one of the what drew me into this project was not just the content that it's going to be about, and it's going to be 150 pages book, and it took like a month for us to do just chapter 1. So but the one great idea was that we're going to get a lot of feedback from different comic scholars and experts, and I think that was an opportunity for us as an artist to also grow and
How many pages were there in the first chapter?
15.
15,
Okay.
and you've got 150.
Yeah.
Whoa.
So hopefully you'll see this book.
But I was just going to add,
year.
so Kanchan mentioned Jessica Abel, and I said, oh yes, I've been using, for the past 3 days in the workshop, I've been using her exercises. She's one of the leading cartoonist educators as well as an artist. Shall I move on? Okay, so I think I've mentioned enough about the inking woman. So that was this is an edited book. I'll just say a little bit about why. So my PhD, as I mentioned, was the history of culture, because she is based in Britain, and I think that's more interesting than trying to work out what we mean by British in this day. One of my case studies was greetings cards company woman, Kath Tate, who set up a greeting cards company using cartoons by women. So I became friendly with her, and what she'd always wanted to do was have since the 80s, is have an exhibition of women's cartoons in London, and no one had taken her seriously. But she now has a very successful card company, a monetary success. So she went to the gallery and said, how about we have a cartoon exhibition? Here's the cash. And you know, the old saying, money opens doors. So she was very happy to be a collaborator and curator of this exhibition, a lot of which came from her archive. And then I was brought into another teamwork, really, as the editor of the book, because I said, and they would agree, they were saying it too, you can have a wonderful exhibition and you can have some online presence of an exhibition of women's cartoons and comics, but online at the moment is still not forever. So you can have a great website, but in 2 years it may have vanished or gone. So it needs still, certainly in a Western context, to be printed, to go into the archives, to create a history. There has never been any historical writing on women's cartoons and comics in Britain, and we wanted to make it very visual and very readable to a wide readership. So that's where we are with that, and we were very, and again, Kath Tate funded the publication of that. And part of it was, you know, we went back for 250 years in Britain, including, this is a banner or poster made by the suffragettes in the early 1900s. And we in the comics community call this a comic because, like Kanchan was referring to the panels, the boxes of comics language, and this has boxes, panels, and it also uses text. The other big thing about comics, and it's your interest is also in the text, is this combination of picture and text, of word and image. And finally, to leave us a few minutes for discussion points, the project I'm working on currently is called Expectations, and again, it's there's a government funding body in Britain called the Arts Council England that collaborates with British Council to fund projects that develop exchanges between artists in different countries. And so I made contact with Kokachi Studio based in Kerala in India, and Priya Kurian, a leading Indian illustrator who has also edited the book The Drawing Line. And together we're doing a book based on the experience of your expectations of visiting a country you've never been to and the realities. So they visited this summer, 3 of them visited me in Britain, and the common link is a train line, which is also a historical link between Britain and India. And so that was really good fun and very entertaining, and I'm glad to say they had a good experience in Britain. And so in February in January I will go to India to have an experience of India with them, and perhaps and the reason this started was because I visited India 30 years ago as a young woman, and so the idea of going back is actually not only will the country have changed, but I'll have changed in my own expectations. Did they say that? Did they? Yeah.
So there's 10 minutes if you have any questions.
Aha, great. Is there a mic? Oh, great.
Hello.
Hello.
My question is for both of you. I have a huge interest in history and revolutions, but most of the youth of my age, they don't have interest in history because they say that history has gone out of fashion or something like that. And but what I think is history shows the history can tell you about the culture and tradition of the people and their upbringing too. And my question is that what suggestions do you want to give to Nepali artists to use comic as a part of literature, which can reflect history in most elaborative way? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, can I just answer? Going back, I forgot to say. So, no, wrong way. Priya Kurian has just produced a graphic novel about Indira Gandhi, the first Prime Minister of the first woman Prime Minister, sorry, of India. And what's very, very capturing about this book, and a very successful model that I recommend you use, is it captures Indira's personal story growing up, and also frameworks the story in the political context. So her role, and of course it's an important part of Indian history. So it has, and I think that's what you're talking about with your project, is the balance of the personal story as well as the bigger picture. But what she's also done, and I've seen it happening a bit more now, is she's combined the comics form with also text, like passages of just writing. So again, you can give the story of the history. And by the way, history, there's no one history, because the history of comics in Britain is masculine. It's only now we're questioning the history. And that's part of this Creating Heroines project, is about what did we call it? Unrevealed history of women, and that's not just happening in cartoons and comics. In Britain, I think it's happening globally, and so that's what Creating Heroines is about, bringing out those stories. But yes, do it. And again, there's different ways of doing it. I think the example of Priya and your example of working with a team. So you could have academics, you could have writers, drawers, the bits you can't do as a team, and that's quite satisfying. Or you just do it yourself and do the research. Thank you. Did you want to add to this question?
Yeah, I think like it's the same example that we showed earlier about Mouse and Persepolis, because they both explore different histories and of war and revolution, and I think definitely that would be more interesting to our students, but and make history more interesting.
Hello. What's going on?
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, my name is Shiva Sankalpa. Apart from being a literature and art lover, I've been teaching pharmaceutical science for the last 10 years. And my question is to Nicole, that I have heard about your book, that Billy, You and Me, that is the graphic memoir, and that is regarded as one of the very good books for medical education through graphics. And sometimes, even in my career, I try to use some of the very basic sketches to impart my impression to my students. And many times I find it very effective. But rarely, sometimes I find it, sometimes it's some of the students are getting different kind of perception, or maybe graphics are not always, for a very small group of people, it is sometimes giving another message. Have you encountered such...
We have a sound problem?
Have you encountered such experience in your career as a educator and graphic advocator? We want to hear some from your experience.
Thank you so much. That's a great question. And one of the things that is happening in the West, and I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but it's something you should look up, is an organization called graphicmedicine.org. Do you know? And this is exactly that. It was begun by a medical doctor who was exploring the way that stories help people understand their illnesses and convey the experiences. Well, we just heard a prose story, so whether it's been around for some time in written form, and people were starting to do this in drawn form. So, for example, a story around the experience of having cancer. And one of the things about adding the visual is that it's very quick to digest. So if you, the patient, are going through a traumatic experience, it's very exhausting. And unless you are a comfortable reader of text, it's much easier to convey the emotions through the visual. But one of the things that's happened is that particularly now, and I'm not sure in your experience, medical students in the UK and America, they have so much work, and it's about obviously learning the science to cure the patient. But what's missing is an understanding of what the patient is going through. And so that's where the movement graphic medicine is kicking in, is it enables a training doctor to have a feeling of empathy with the patient and with the carers of the patient. So does that some way I just wanted to add a little bit to that, because we were talking earlier about Kanchan's project of time up, 1 minute, 2 minutes of the experience of working with academic researchers. And there's a woman in the UK who calls herself the cartooning psychologist, and she was an academic producing written reports from her research and then distributing it, and she'd say to her colleagues, did you read it? And they'd kind of go so like that, because you know, really tiring, they've got her. Then she tried putting a little cartoon in the middle of this thing, and all her colleagues commented. She wasn't a trained drawer, but she realized this is what captures the attention. It's fun, it's easy, and yet you can convey. So I hope that some way answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you, everybody. And remember, we're being at the stall, the Creating Heroines stall. Please come and see us and look at our books and grab one of the zines.